Snap's second instincts keep us on our toes and save us from situations that may be life-threatening. When those synapses in our brain start firing, we subconsciously take control of a situation before realizing what's actually going on, and they've been saving our lives since, well, forever. When Colorado resident Randy Kerschen was working at his next-door neighbor's house, he never imagined he'd need to fall back on those ancient reflexes. But one second he was engaged in friendly banter, and the next he was fighting for his life. Randy Kerschen and family lived together in Fort Collins, Colorado, where he and his wife made decent money and always looked out for each other. But it wasn't work that drew Randy to the Midwest. Randy was a passionate outdoorsman, and Fort Collins was especially scenic. He knew he could carry out a peaceful existence there and give his kids a safe place to grow up. He felt that way for a long time. You might think someone who spent so much of his time outdoors would eventually run into a dangerous situation, but Randy was always cautious. However, as he learned, sometimes trouble finds you. Early one afternoon, Randy was in a client's driveway cutting shower tiles for a project he was preparing to tackle. A few minutes into his work, a UPS van pulled up. The driver, Alex Rodriguez, stepped out and began to chat with Randy. He was there to deliver a package to the homeowner, but Randy was the first person he saw. While they were talking, Randy thought he saw a quick moving shadow out of the corner of his eye. At first, he thought nothing of it until he turned his head to see what it was. The shadow he saw out of his peripheral vision wasn't some random object. It was a mountain lion, and the beast was staring directly into Randy's eyes. It took a split second for the realization to kick in, and then the animal attacked. "All I keep remembering is that face and those beady eyes looking at me," Randy recalled of the tense moment. "And I knew he was trying to kill me." In a split second, Randy steeled himself. "When I saw him with his claws out and his face coming at my face," Randy said, "I put my arm up, then felt this immense pain, and that's the last pain I felt." The predator was clamping down on his arm with immense force. So Randy fought back. "I got angry," he said, "and I was hoping to grab a hold of his neck, choke him and slam his head on the ground until he quit moving. It was going to be me or him," Randy said. Meanwhile, while Randy and the lion tussled in the driveway, Rodriguez snuck back to the truck. There, he grabbed a wooden plank, returned to the fight, and struck the animal hard with his best home run swing. Miraculously, the mountain lion immediately sprang up from his attack on Randy after being struck with the wood. But he ran off into the backyard, hopped the fence, and continued on his path of destruction. Law enforcement was called to apprehend the wild animal, but once police tracked the cat down, he was ready for battle. The cat was filled with rage when it ran off, and his next victim was a Larimer County Sheriff deputy. That officer, Michelle Ross, was immediately pulled to the ground by the cat's jaws. He tugged and pulled at her until, finally, another officer was able to roundhouse kick it in the head. Then, wildlife officials shot the predator dead. Ross was interviewed afterwards, along with Randy, so they both could talk about the horrific incident they endured. Even though they lived in Colorado, they never encountered a situation like that before. The officer was lucky to have a team of people around her, unlike Randy. The 91-pound cat could have done way more damage if she were alone, regardless of her bulletproof vest. Immediately after the attack on Randy, he was brought to McKee Medical Center in Loveland, where they treated the wounds the cat inflicted upon him. Workers then discovered something about the cat that made the attack far worse. The animal tested positive for rabies. Rabies can be deadly if untreated, so it was imperative Randy was given all the proper medication. Luckily, doctors got to him in time, but he was still suffering. After the attack, Randy, who had never before seen a mountain lion in the wild despite 20 years of hiking and fishing, needed therapy to help him recover. "He's definitely mentally strong," his daughter, Sydney, said. "I know he will get through it." A GoFundMe page was set up to cover Randy's hospital expenses, and people from all over pitched in to help. Luckily, the dad knew there was a family in New Hampshire that he could reach out to with help coping. The O'Reillys lived in New Hampshire, and they took every opportunity they could to spend time in their state's beautiful nature. Ian and Allison passed on their outdoorsy passion to their kids, but they never expected to place their children in danger. See, around the O'Reillys' home in Exeter, police were trying to track down an animal culprit harassing locals. One 62-year-old woman and her frightened dogs had to flee when a predator chased them out of the woods. Another resident got a much better look at the beast. He was just driving down the road when a wild coyote attempted to attack him through his car. The glass and steel protected him, though it didn't make sense why the animal was so aggressive. Allison and Ian heard these reports but didn't worry about them too much. After all, New Hampshire was a big place full of wildlife. They wouldn't let a couple scares ruin their plans for a wintry hike in 2020. The five O'Reillys were retracing a trek they'd completed just a few weeks prior. It took just about 2.5 hours, the perfect amount of time to stretch their legs without tiring the kids out. What could go wrong? The second journey began much like the first. Everyone took in the picturesque views and shared jokes and stories. They were having such a fun time that nobody noticed a stranger was stalking them. Against all odds, the Coyote found them in the New England wilderness. The O'Reillys didn't see the feral canine at first until it announced its presence in the most horrifying way imaginable. It pounced on their preschool-aged son. Allison yanked him out from under the creature, not yet realizing the threat they were facing. Instead, the couple was thinking it was a dog off-leash who just bumped into son. Then the truth clicked in Ian's mind. This was no dog. This was a bloodthirsty predator, and they were the prey. Not knowing what else to do, the dad stepped between the Coyote and his family. He was terrified of what would happen next. Ian's top priority was getting his wife and kids to safety. He yelled at them to run as fast as they could. Turning back toward the Coyote, Ian lifted his heavy hiking boot and kicked its ribs with all his might. That only made the rabid canine even angrier. It knocked Ian to the ground, toppling him just as easily as it did his young child, and bit at his chest. Fangs tore right through the hiker's winter jacket and punctured his skin. Ian managed to spot his family vanishing in the distance, and he shouted for them to keep moving. At that moment, his terror gave way to anger. What business did this animal have for attacking his family? Ian was going to teach it a lesson. A talented endurance athlete, Ian clamped his hands around the canine's snout and squeezed its body between its legs. That completely shut off any airflow in the predator's windpipe. That coyote was very much interested in living, but so were we, he later reflected. Ian didn't let the coyote go, as it could easily sprint off and go after his kids. Exhausted, he kept up the pressure until the animal stopped breathing. He realized he'd killed the beast out of pure instinct, like it was almost like a logical next step. Of course, Ian was much worse for the wear. Every muscle in his body shook with fatigue, and he was bleeding all over from claw and bite marks. The father limped back to his family, and Allison whisked him off to the hospital. The O'Reillys have been surprisingly well adjusted since the harrowing attack. Allison's work as a PTSD trauma expert helped them all, though their youngest had trouble sleeping in his own bed afterwards. And this wasn't the O'Reillys' only brush with danger. As much as they traveled, the O'Reilly family had their first brush with the uglier side of nature in their own backyard. Ian was startled when he heard his son utter a cry of delight, followed by a scream. It turned out a raccoon, and a rabid one at that, was living under their porch. The vicious creature bit the O'Reilly boy on his knee. As Allison pulled him away from the raccoon, a scab on her hand was exposed to his wound. Both mother and son needed rabies vaccinations afterward, but made immediate recoveries. In a sense, Ian counted himself lucky. As unfortunate as the raccoon attack was, the family is hopefully predator-free for the foreseeable future. But Ian is still traumatized. The rustle of a bush still makes Ian's heart beat faster, but he doesn't let that fear keep him from his outdoor adventures. He can at least take comfort in knowing he defended his family. However, a debate regarding natural predators is splitting wildlife enthusiasts all over the country. If you were hiking through a remote part of California a few years ago, you might have been warned about grizzly bears. But the chances of coming face to face with any other potentially dangerous animals, especially wolves, wasn't very likely. In fact, coming across an actual wolf sounds fairly far-fetched to a regular tourist or hiker. In the early 1920s, though, this was a different story. Back then, wolves prowled California's remote forests and farms alike, which posed a dangerous problem. Because of this, farmers and wolves were constantly at odds. Farmers often hunted wolves in hopes of avoiding a barnyard massacre. They couldn't have known then the damage they were inflicting, and not just on the wolves. In 1924, the very last gray wolf was killed. For the next 90 years, California didn't have any wolves in an area that could support up to 500 of them. Unbeknownst to farmers, the species' absence shifted the balance of the ecosystems they used to inhabit. Wolves keep in check, which helps vegetation not get overeaten. That vegetation provides nesting habitat for migrating birds and building material for beavers, which create ponds for frogs and fish, said biologist Amarok Weiss. And this domino effect was not only noticed by biologists. See, if something good came out of the mass wolf killings in the 20s, It's that the negative effects alerted researchers nationwide to the dwindling population of gray wolves. So in 1975, the gray wolf received federal endangered species protections, but there weren't any wolves left to protect. That is, until 2011, when one lone gray wolf wandered into Siskiyou County from Oregon. Biologists were stunned by this sudden re-emergence. Without a pack to lead or to protect him, this endangered wolf had traveled into an entirely new state and immediately became an icon. Though biologists designated him R7, activists named him Journey in honor of his daring cross-state trek. A GPS collar tracked and recorded his personal hike, as well as his encounters with other animals. According to his GPS collar, Journey found a mate, likely another migrated wolf, and added 5 pups to the state's gray wolf population. He then migrated back to Oregon and fathered more pups. It seemed like those were the last wild wolf pups California would ever see. It was believed that, as of 2015, the population of wild gray wolves in California was an alarmingly small 7. Since 2 of the 7 wolves were wearing GPS collars, biologists thought that enough of the state's wolves were being tracked. So imagine biologists' shock when, in 2019, 2 adult wolves were seen caring for 3 young pups in California. Biologists had no idea these wolves were even there, let alone that they were having pups. Even more unexpected was the way biologists discovered the pack. The pack was seen hunting and resting on a trail camera in a remote part of Lassen County. The 3 pups snacked on grass and howled at each other before passing through. Though it only lasts a minute, this footage created a huge stir in the environmental community. Having wolves return to California is one of the most significant environmental developments in conservation in this state, Weiss asserted. This sounds like triumphant news for conservationists and activists everywhere, but some people are far from happy about the wolves' return. Farmers and hunters have always tried to subdue the wolf population in California in order to protect their valuable sheep and cattle, and this didn't change when California's Fish and Game Commission granted gray wolves special protection under the state's Endangered Species Act in 2014. Now that the population seems to be slowly ratcheting upwards, farmers are once again in fear of their livestock being hunted. When California's Farm Bureau Federation took the matter to court, the fate of the wolves was put into jeopardy. Farmers weren't the only group threatening California's wolf population either. The federal government, too, pushed to remove gray wolves from the endangered species list, meaning they would no longer benefit from federal protection. Everything, it seemed, would all come down to the lawsuit. In the end, the consensus among the scientific community and the court was clear: no matter what happened at a federal level, California's gray wolves would be protected under state law. In a perfect world, this would keep the gray wolves safe from hunters. If they're coming from the Oregon side of the border or from Nevada, once they set a paw down in California they are protected, Weiss said. But these idealistic words would not become a reality anytime soon. Late last year, a California-born wolf pack mysteriously vanished in remote Siskiyou County. Since biologists weren't able to collar any pack members, they may never know what happened to the pack. What's more, they're not the only mystery to plague California's Department of Fish and Wildlife. They're also investigating the death of a young wolf that was mysteriously killed in Modoc County. It was handled as a criminal investigation, and the police warned the public that killing a wolf is a potential crime punishable with imprisonment. These tragic events only make the recent pack sighting on the trail camera all the more inspiring. Despite the resistance from the farming community, biologists remain hopeful that the wolves will one day lead many wild packs across California and beyond. Anyone doubting the importance of wolves need look no further than Yellowstone National Park. In the 80s and early 90s, the beautiful scenery was completely ravaged. And it was all thanks to the wolves, or lack thereof. See, as mentioned, before 1926, Yellowstone National Park was full of wolves. They thrived there, but within the first few decades of the 1900s, government predator control programs wiped them out entirely. This was a problem. No one saw another wolf until 1977, about 50 years later, but, even then, it was a lone wolf or 2 merely wandering through. Oddly, it was the lack of these wolves that led to the park's decline. With no predators to fear, the deer population absolutely exploded. They could eat and overgraze all they wanted without worrying about wolves. Soon, the forests and meadows were barren, but the deer and their ilk kept at it. As the deer kept grazing, taking all the resources for themselves, the other animals suffered. Creatures that dined on fauna stood no chance in the food race against deer. Animals that ate those animals saw their food supply dwindle. And the rapid loss of vegetation didn't just leave the forests bare. Without vegetation keeping soil in place, the rivers that ran through Yellowstone began eroding, which prompted the loss of many animal species who relied on healthy waters to survive. Yellowstone was struggling, and park employees needed to find a solution. It really all boiled down to the high numbers of deer they knew, so, in 1995, they hatched a plan. The deer needed predators, plain and simple, and workers figured this would be the perfect time to reintroduce wolves back into Yellowstone. Packs of gray wolves were released into the park, and hopeful employees prayed it was the answer. Now, the deer were suddenly thrust back into the predator versus prey world, and even though there were far fewer wolves than deer, the wolves were fearsome hunters. They welcomed the challenge. Day and night, the battle ensued, and the wolves were the victors nearly every time. This relationship between the wolves and deer is known as top-down control. Top-down control is when predators who sit atop the food chain assist with the regulation of the animals who are beneath them. That's exactly what happened when the wolves were reintroduced. With deer numbers dwindling, the vegetation flourished. Aspen and willow trees that hadn't seen a successful life for decades finally grew back tenfold, and it seemed they were healthier than ever. But the trees were just the very beginning of the massive change. The waterways running through the parks began changing, and the regenerated vegetation growing on the riverbeds brought with it a whole new array of life not seen in such a long time. For the first time in forever, beavers returned to the water. They began constructing their intricate dams, which contributed to a habitat that attracted a variety of reptiles, otters, and muskrats. Because of the increased vegetation, mice and rabbits thrived, which, in turn, gave the red fox an amazing feasting opportunity. Red fox numbers grew, and still, there was even more happening. The number of bears also increased. The deer had scoured bushes and ate the same berries the bears enjoyed, but with the berries now finally plentiful again, the bears could eat without a problem. Through it all, the wolves gained a feathery friend. Ravens are known to follow behind wolves and pick at the remains of whatever they hunt and kill. The four-legged assassins were hard at work, and those ravens were always close behind. The new lush vegetation not only benefited all of the animals, but it helped drastically slow down, and sometimes completely stop, the erosion of riverbeds. The changes were nothing short of miraculous. Incredibly, the wolves, although nowhere near as abundant in numbers as the deer they hunted, managed to not only change the ecosystem, but the physical geography of Yellowstone National Park. It was a feat that had every park employee and wolf howling with joyous pride. What's most shocking about this development was how few wolves it took to really change Yellowstone for the better. Still, this reflects a human truth. It only takes a handful of people to make a huge difference.